studio, in an incredible studio today with a couple really incredible producers, hosts. I'm gonna let y'all introduce yourselves. Why don't you go ahead? Maybe let's, tell us who you are, and maybe say your name. And when people usually ask you who you are and what you do, what do you usually say?
My name is Damon Williams. I'm a movement builder, artist, and media maker from the South Side of Chicago. I'm a co-founder of Respair Production and Media, co-host and co-creator of Help This Garden Grow. And we are in the Malika Leem Studios at the Breathing Room space, stewarded by the Let Us Breathe Collective.
I'm Daniel Kisslinger. I am the starting shortstop for two 12-inch softball teams this summer, as well as the co-founder of Respair Production and Media. It's just such a pleasure to get to sit down with you.
I'm a fan of you both from afar for many years.
Not from that much of afar. I would say from medium distance.
True, you're right. Medium.
From proximity.
Yeah. But it's been a while. So maybe before we get into it, can you talk a little bit about Respair and this media company? Because I think it's important to, I'm just curious the way that it connects in particular with the kind of work and the kind of media that you make in particular.
Yeah.
Sure.
So Respair is the umbrella organization aiming to not only nurture our work, but the ecosystem in which our work exists. So since 2015, we've been doing this podcast, Ergo, which is really our flagship project, where we talk to folks who are transforming culture for the more liberatory and creative. And so that has meant talking to organizers, folks in movement, artists, educators, practitioners across a bunch of different fields, while also participating in, supporting, and being in community with liberatory justice movements in Chicago and beyond. And so what started as kind of a post-college passion project that we were just very committed to and never wanted to stop became our life's work. And what we really realized is for anything to really flourish, it needs to be nurtured. And nurturing happens in ecosystems, and nurturing happens within context. And so in addition to wanting to create more projects about liberation, we realized that the folks who are on the ground doing the work and the folks who are in position or have the will to or the skill to communicate the work that's happening need to be in deeper relationship. And so Respair is an antiquated word that means the return to hope, the path towards returning to hope. So it's the antithesis of despair. And for folks who are seeing all of the ways in which basically every system in the world is collapsing, that could be really overwhelming. But, to kind of build off.
Except for my softball team.
Yeah. Yeah, y'all are on the rise. Y'all have ticked up the last
it's a
few
rebuild year, but we're getting there.
Following in the ideas of Mariam Kaba of hope as a discipline, we believe that seeing the people who are doing the work to resist and transform and create new possibilities is what makes that discipline possible. And so there's so much content about so many things, and there needs to be more conversation, more eyes, more ears paying attention to liberation.
Yeah. So and Ergo was kind of this beautiful passion project between you two, project, a form of your activism that then you were like, what can we take this to the next level? Let me back up a little bit though. How'd y'all meet? What's your relationship?
So Damon and I went to college together in Iowa, Grinnell College, and we're in a couple classes together. We're friendly, same friend groups, but weren't super, super close. But we both worked at the radio station. And then our senior year, I had a show where I was doing interviews with a lot of Chicago artists kind of at the time that scene was really emerging, 2012, 2013. And it was a context that Dame was really a part of. And so as one of the people leading the radio station, I was like, there's this amazing thing happening 4.5 hours away. How do we bring some of that magic to campus? And so we worked together. The first thing we ever made together was a concert that brought No Name, Jamila, and Damon and his sister to campus to perform. And then we also worked together. I was managing a friend who was an artist at the time, and we did this big concert with a live band in the main venue, chapel on campus, and Dame was part of that. And in the rehearsals, it was, so we started making things together kind of before we were super, super close.
Wow, natural collaborators.
Yeah.
That's such a gift.
And then came to Chicago with that mutual respect being established. And I saw that this guy moved here, and I would see him in space. So, around the hip hop poetic scene, a lot of it being, organized by young Chicago authors. But then really, in addition to at a performance series or an open mic or listening party, what really deepened is as started entering a movement in 2014 after the Ferguson uprising and continuing organizing here in Chicago, seeing that Daniel was also using his skills to be present for that work. And then there was one protest or march where I was chanting and pushing this very what's the actual appropriate word to say? Rigged up. I'll say this rigged up sound system that was like a car battery with jumper cables on a dolly. And then
we use the word precarious a lot.
Yeah, it was a precarious
that was
thing.
Precarious.
And I was just used to it. Like, and by that time we had been doing it for a couple of months, and that's just something that you do. And then someone came and started pushing the dolly for me, and I looked to my right, and Daniel was there, and I didn't even know he was at the action. And that moment to me was the symbolic seed of oh, there's a deeper trust and connection. And then this guy was like, hey, I want to be on the radio, and I have this idea. Let's kind of shape it out together. And we got on WHPK and started doing Ergo every week as a live show and ripping that audio and doing the podcast. And then over time, as the podcasting world has grown and shaped, we have become podcasters.
Yeah, we were doing it not just before the boom, but before when people would be like, oh, that's cute, you have a podcast, but I want to come on your community radio show. That's where the juice
cool.
is,
We love, shout out community radio.
Big time.
So, okay, y'all had reached out a little while ago about this series that you made together. And this was your first, this was kind of the first big project of Respair. And this is a big project. And so impressive. Okay, I want to hear you talk about it. So tell us about it. Tell us about what led you in particular to making Help This Garden Grow.
For sure. So Help This Garden Grow is a 6-part audio documentary series about the life and multiple legacies of environmental justice visionary Hazel Johnson, who is deemed by many as one of, if not the mother of the modern environmental justice movement. And Hazel lived for many years in Altgeld Gardens on the far south side of the city, in a public housing development called Altgeld Gardens that's surrounded by some of the most unimaginably damaging environmental devastation, toxic pollution. And she, from dogged, pointed inquiry about why things were happening to her and her community, basically played a pivotal role in the building of what is now, I would argue, one of the most influential and important liberatory movements around the world, which we call environmental justice. And we came to this story, it wasn't either of our entry points, environmental justice. We both have been involved, like Dave mentioned, between the artistic cultural community and then, really involved in what's been, deemed, to use a kind of umbrella term, the movement for Black Lives over the last 10 years. And as we did that work and had these conversations every week on the air with people who are doing the work of transforming our city, our world, this thread emerged of the people who felt the most, not like they had it figured out, but who had concrete hands in the soil, were the people who, one, I just really enjoyed talking to, but also it felt like, in many ways, if not a solution, at least an answer to a lot of the questions that we've been asking about, what's the infrastructure that we need to be investing into? Who are the people who are thinking intentionally about repair and what that means for our land, our relationship to land, our relationship between structural power? And so we partnered with some collaborators at an organization called Elevate. Shout out Sylvia Ewing and Ann Evans over there, who came to us in 2019, came out in 2020 to build this project called Climate Change Makers. We were interviewing different climate justice activists, EJ workers. And as we were doing that over the course of 2 seasons, we just kept hearing the name Hazel Johnson come up. And as is kind of our methodology, it was all right, let's go learn more. We got to know who this person is, why all these people who are doing this meaningful work kind of name her with a reverence that doesn't match the fact that we don't know who she is. And so we went looking for the documentary. There wasn't one.
So we're like,
and
we're gonna
all right, we're going to take that on.
Like Hazel, like, I'm going to go make this thing and do this thing. I mean,
Exactly.
but just to kind of like put in perspective, right? Like testing, like, you know, you move into an apartment and you got to know like the lead, like this has been tested for lead and there's no lead here, or asbestos, or like soil testing. Like Hazel did all this, right? Can you kind of just tell us like things that Hazel did are just what we understand? No landfills in Chicago, like these, we owe quote unquote owe this, but like this is the work of Hazel. Can you tell us, like, not to like spoil, but I mean, like, people don't understand, or I didn't understand when I was listening. I just take for granted, you know, you get all this paperwork when you move into an apartment, and it's like, oh no, somebody created like the work around I don't know, these laws, these ordinances in Chicago.
I would say you know, as the show has come out, kind of the ultimate tangible impact of her work has come through, because now the Environmental Protection Agency and other governmental agencies now use a framework called cumulative impact. And that is basically what Hazel was naming, is that there are so many harms and hazards that my community is experiencing at the same time that we actually don't need to isolate and focus on just one thing. We need to look at how all of these things accumulate, and we need to have multiple approaches towards making sure that our environment is clean, healthy, and safe. And so some of that work looked like establishing access to the main water main for a nearby development, working and getting rid of fiberglass in attics, asbestos in the buildings. Obviously, our city is highly contaminated with lead in how we built the buildings, the pipes of our water. And then you named exactly that, you know, one of the big fights that they were a part of is getting a moratorium on the building of new landfills in Chicago. And so Altgeld Gardens is built upon multiple landfills and surrounded by landfills. And so they really are the front lines, or, you know, the language ground zero comes up, but that speaks to catastrophe that I don't want to reify. But I also don't want to underplay how hazardous this community, where Black folks were intentionally placed to be an access to labor and to keep away, you know, also. And so now we see our city and our governmental agencies, after years of denying this approach of like, well, if you can't tell us which chemical caused this cancer,
which
and
chemical is guilty,
which industry, which, you know, corporation is the one that brought out this chemical, then there's nothing we can do. Now there's an approach of how do we assess the way all of these multiple factors overlap and compound and accumulate to affect our health, because her husband passed and little girls had rare cancers, and cancers that were supposed to be rare were not rare in her community.
And all, like, basically that, like what you're saying, like the accumulation, like all these things are all these hazardous, like life-threatening, like I'm like these murderous environmental outcomes, like this getting seen and this getting the attention that it did for it to be observed and seen this way, it was because of Hazel's work. Is that correct?
I mean, it's important to note that she is unique and important, but was not alone, right? So she existed within a movement, and, you know, coming out of the Black freedom movement, the civil rights movement, the Black power movement in cities. Basically, one of the things we learned is environmental justice. Once Black folks were deemed citizens, so to speak, from the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, more or less one of the first ways in which that citizenship was used is addressing institutions about environmental hazards and toxics. So there were also folks in Texas and folks in North Carolina and folks in Harlem and folks in California that were doing similar work.
And in other parts of Chicago and Southeast Chicago as well. You know, right on the other side of the river is the Southeast side, which is where the steel plants were. And there has been, going back to when she started, incredible organizing, and she was part of coalition across the city, but especially across the region into Whiting, Indiana, where the BP refineries are. So she was not, like you said, alone.
We're trying to be careful, but yes,
I hear you.
She was instrumental in taking this all over the world, all the way to the White House. And what's so valuable about it is that this framing is not only needed to address environmental toxic chemicals. It is the framing of how we should look at all politics, right? You know, you sit down with a police officer and they say, well, what about the schools? And you sit down with the schools and it's like, well, what about the households and the families? And, you know, there's always this passing of the buck of culpability, accountability to harm and destruction in our community, and trying to separate and isolate and bureaucratize systems. And the truth is, systems compound to affect us, and we have to use a cumulative approach to address all things. So all inequities, all harms, the way in which we get to a more repaired, restored reality is through using this approach that Hazel really championed in terms of what was affecting her neighborhood and her community.
Wow, that makes so much sense. You guys have really, you must have thought about this before. You're really good at, yeah.
People, I think, use the word intentional a lot, and some of it doesn't. It matters what the intention is, and I think we were like intentional and thoughtful because, like you said, this one was the first time stepping into telling a story this way, but also, like, yes, we want people to hear it, but this was at its core a contribution to the people continuing this work and continuing this legacy, and especially Hazel's daughter Cheryl, who runs People for Community Recovery now. And it's like, not only do we have to be thoughtful about the story we're telling, but it's also about how we tell the story, our relationship to the people who are leading this work. And this wasn't the first time that we thought about those questions. And so we had some framework stepping into that.
And the responsibility of being trusted.
Yeah.
You know, and like you have to hold that. So we kind of have loose trust with an audience that, you know, will bring, you know, quality conversations or good information. But now we were really putting ourselves out there with people whose this was their life and their life's work, and we needed to steward it responsibly.
That's actually kind of leads into my question, and something that you talk about. You said it really eloquently, and also like how from the jump, like this show is rooted in people's experiences. We are the experts because this is our lives.
Right.
This is our life. And you know, Damon, like I, you know, love that you're like, yeah, like this is part of my childhood. And also at one point it's like Nate, I guess I'm gonna, okay, I'll stop. Just why, I think for a lot of people making media or ideas around, I don't know, I want to just say like status quo journalism, that this idea that like, oh, us being experts is actually something that like we should, like people are critical of, but whereas in this work in particular, and also like people who live in this area are the ones who are affected, and affected as in dying.
But also affected as in motivated to try to figure out what the hell is going on.
Well, and that, right?
Motivated to figure out what's going on.
Well, because it's like nobody else is, who else is gonna, right? And that's actually like the power and the most beautiful thing I think about people. You know, Hazel really struck me and the other people named in this as like the like most DIY
Exactly.
like it could be no other way, and how beautiful and powerful. So I guess back to my question was like kind of just naming like, how did it feel to be part of this story personally in that way, and like was it hard?
Yeah, it was hard, because there's a both and of like, I have family connections to Outgirl Gardens. I kind of in my middle school age time was like kind of co-lived in Dalton for a little bit, and so I would drive past it every day, but also didn't have intimate relationship or interaction with it. So I felt connected but also distant, and it's usually, like I say in the show, like when I think of Outgirl Gardens, it usually feels like a black and white flashback, because I'm thinking of the stories my grandmother and my mother is telling me from the 70s and 80s. But then, you know, also it is a Chicago story, and I feel very passionate about, you know, being responsible for stewarding Chicago. I, you know, am a third generation or fourth generation Black South Side Chicagoan. And so, you know, reading something like, we mentioned lead already, like that Chicago's water system is one of the major cities like the most impacted by lead contamination. And I had heard or knew that in some ways abstractly, but in trying to tell this story of theoretically like fights that have been air quote won already, seeing how much of the harm is still present, right? So lead throughout the city is an example of that, but going through the story and, when you look on the website or when you get the like cursory one paragraph description of their work, the fight against PCBs is labeled as a win. And then into learning and actually digging in that like, no, all of these chemicals were not cleaned up and they are still present and are still harming folks. But at the same time, trying to be funny or informative or interesting, right? Like, talking about chemistry and compounds and EPA agents and, institutional processes flatly is not like the most exciting thing. So you're trying to put energy and bring a certain presence to it, but also give it the seriousness and the weight that it needs, while realizing that like a lot of people have been harmed by this, and even people who have been impacted. There's a both and of like, there are people who've been on the front lines, but then also people who've been impacted by this who do not know. And so then the responsibility of that, of like, hey, whether you live in the All-Gil Gardens or not, but especially if you were in that space, you were harmed and you may not have faced that yet. And so you have to create a really comfortable, sensitive, care-based space to invite people into such a conversation.
I just want to say too, like, I never experienced like care as a listener in that way. Like, not to spoil, not it's not a spoiler, but you're like, hey, this is heavy, y'all. Like, let's take a breath. And honestly, and I like did it, and it felt so good. It really worked, and it felt so good. And I was like, I don't know, so thanks for that. That was beautiful, and it is heavy, and it's really sad, and you did a really good job of balancing, of course, like the feeling of helplessness with like incredible power that people have, and that we see, and that we all, Also, I had a dream last night that I was like, I need to get a water filter. Like, I dreamt about clean water.
Podcast Loki should have been paid for and sponsored by Brita. Yeah. If we were gonna sell out, I feel like the Brita sponsorship would have been key. And they have ones now that can remove lead, which they didn't used to have. You can get them; they're only a little bit more expensive, but they can pull like 99.9% of lead out of your water.
Cool. And yeah, like this is still everybody should be drinking out of the water filters. Like that's what it kind of. I was like,
Yeah, no, for sure.
You named something in that. Well, this one kind of like my last question before just like whatever you guys want to talk about. Something that you talked about was the way that winning a campaign, quote air quotes winning. There is nuance in the way that these campaigns, like Hazel and all the organizers here and continue to work. Like losing is not losing. Winning doesn't mean that you've actually won per se. And I wanted to just kind of, can you talk about that in terms of it's not the same like how it is like with candidates, and it's actually really important to be just, I don't know. Yeah. The show talked about this, and I'm curious if you can kind of go into that a little bit.
Yeah. For sure.
I think it's important. So in organizing, there's this language of power mapping, right? And so it's really important whenever you're talking about any systemic issue that you have a lens of power. And the thing that's uncomfortable to name out loud, because we want to stand in and project our power so much, is, if we're being honest and looking at it, pseudo-journalistically, there is an asymmetry in power when dealing with these powerful, entrenched institutions. And they know that, right? And so at the most insidious, movements that are often grassroots are very insurgent or hyper-resistant and name out. And so institutions learn that, we can repress or ignore or silence that, but that also takes energy and resources on their end. Or we can, do surface level reforms or invite folks in or create, task force, an advisory group. And it's complicated because valuable things can come from that. Visibility can come from that. Expounding information, maybe some access to resources come from that, maybe mitigating or reducing some harm may happen. But also what happens, in the example of the story, the White House creates a task force, and now environmental justice organizations from all over the country are using their budgets to fly people to DC for free. And so, when you're doing your work, it's like, how proud are you? Like, oh, I'm going to the White House. I'm representing my community. I'm at the height of government power for the world. But now I'm not doing my food program or my lead abatement program with the same energy, or these frequent flyer miles are not enough to address the fact that I'm already underpaid. And so, that is one example of sometimes bringing folks inside can dilute some of the energy that is needed outside.
And that access is fraught, right? And can be revoked.
Mm-hmm.
And then can be revoked, and often is revoked, if people challenge the policies of the people that have invited them in. And then you're put on the outside, and you still don't have the program that you weren't able to run because you were busy going back and forth to DC. So it's not just like the trade-offs of access versus grassroots. It's like the grassroots power can be sustained in a way that access can actually be taken away if you challenge the people who hold that power. Like you have I'm saying this like as a loaded term, like you have the privilege of being a participant, but you don't have the power to decide what happens to the participants in that space. But you do in the work that you build collectively. You have the power to decide collectively what happens in that room.
And so you're working against institutions that have the power to determine the terms of the air quote win. And so not only can it quell, organizing capacity, it also can demobilize your support. So, we see in the show, for example, there's a settlement, air quote, again.
We're leading the league in air quotes.
Against, can you say what PCBs stand for? I'm bad at saying
polychlorinated bifenols.
Thank you. The fight against PCB is one of the most harmful chemicals to the human body. There was a court case in a settlement, but all of the funds and resources went back to paying CHA, which was the entity that committed harm. But throughout the community, or when people hear the story, it's like, well, didn't y'all get a settlement? Didn't you, do we need to show up for folks where it's been remedied? I parallel that to, I've worked with the Chicago Torture Justice Center, which is birthed out of the country's first reparations ordinance of police torture against Black people. And there was a settlement that of the hundreds of people that were tortured, 57 people received. And if you had already received a settlement, the amount that came from the reparations ordinance was deduced against that. So you can get up to $100,000, but if you already at 50 or 60, then you got 40, right? But people all through the news all over the world have heard there was a reparations ordinance. There's a settlement. Wasn't this taken care of? Wasn't this remedied? And folks who are survivors of torture still need support. Reparations needs to be expanded. The PCBs were still there, still need to be cleaned up. Folks actually do deserve financial compensation and an institution and so much more. But if the entity, the White House, the city, the whatever, can put out the press release that we have agreed to a settlement, we have agreed to this nominal win, folks who then receive that passively, who could be in support, are now demobilized. Like, well, then the issue is not at hand anymore.
Well, I think too, I always think of, No Cop Academy. Exactly. And how, yes, that was built. So that was a quote, loss, of course, not even quote. That was a loss. Yeah. But the organizing and the coalition building and what came out of that loss. And I think
if your demands are big enough, you should lose.
Ooh, damn.
And then sometimes you win, but you should lose.
Yeah, wait, what?
Don't pull that. This is the beauty of our own thing, is that no one can pull that clip against us, so please don't
worry about it.
But yeah, organize the 2020 uprising would not have had the on boot experience organizers if it wasn't for the No Cop Academy campaign. So many young folks were able to just, transfer their frustration, fear, anger, resentment of police into power building, into resistance, and into communicating with so many folks in neighborhoods and in communities. And so when you come back around and you have the next conversation to have, you're not starting at square one. And so that was a great example of, yes, the Cop Academy is being built, but so many people were activated from that campaign, and so much was learned and so much was created that it moved us forward.
So
Freedom Square, Holman Square is still there, but that changed people's lives.
So beautiful. Maybe we can get some photos of this. Anyways, so yeah, this show also, as you say at the beginning, there's so much information. This is a very dense history, while simultaneously you're holding, like we talked about, the care, the voices, and then this going back in time, going forward in time, staying in the present. And also, a call to action for folks, or giving listeners a space to think about what they want to do with this information, and or what the show is for. And I feel like in general the ethos of your company, and ergo too, like movement media, like what are you hoping people come away from this show with in particular?
For sure. So to do the overall zoom out for a second, everything we make is like, yes, we want to engage, entertain, illuminate, but the point of this work is to move people into action. And so there are two kind of twin calls to action at the center of the story, Help This Garden Grow. One is to do what Hazel did, which, as she puts it, is to like take care of your shoebox. The quote, and we can give you this to put in, but the quote is, "I'd rather live in my own shoebox than somebody else's mansion, but you have to take care of your own shoebox in order to be able to live in it." And so that's what we were pushed in ourselves to do, and that's what we've like encouraged and seen listeners really grab onto. Look at the space wherever it is that you are, examine like how it came to be shaped the way it is, politically, socioeconomically, environmentally, and that can be whether you're at the spear tip experiencing the most dramatic harm of structural violence, or if you're a beneficiary of that structural violence. There's that same question opens the door to understanding the way that power is playing out all around you. And then once you start paying attention and asking those questions, find the people in your space who are already searching for those answers, already building the work to try to address those harms, no matter where you are. So that's one, take care of your shoebox.
And if there's not people that you can find, then have the conversations with the people that need to know,
Yeah, and build your own space, build your own container, but start by seeing who else is already asking those questions and doing that work. And then the second call to action, the second takeaway, this story is about the many legacies of Hazel's work. And that shows up in a lot of different forms. That shows up in the work that's continued, the people who look to her as part of their lineage. The street that the garden sits on is named Hazel Johnson E.J. Way. There's various like honorary statements made each year by Illinois legislature, the city, all that kind of stuff. And that's great. It's part of how we learned about Hazel's significance. But Hazel was actually really concrete about what she wanted her legacy to be, which was a space in the gardens, which Cheryl worked to be known as the Hazel Johnson Environmental Justice Center, which would be, in addition to a museum about EJ work happening all over the world, would be a gathering space for people in the gardens and a training ground and educational institution for people living there to become scientists, policy workers, organizers, people who could take the lead on the actual cleanup that could happen in the gardens to the damage that's still there. A place for people to be able to have health testing that's never been done. But in addition to just receiving that, to be trained to be the people who can offer the care that's been needed this whole time. And so there's a building, it's an old school building that PCR, that People for Community Recovery was actually able to save from demolition, that they're in the process of trying to get the resources and the permitting to convert into this Hazel Johnson Environmental Center, this Hazel Johnson Environmental Justice Center. And so that's the other call to action, is think about what are the resources, relationships to power, connections that you may have to help gather the support to get that building built and actually really create the legacy that Hazel was asking for, demanding, and named very, very clearly for herself. So take care of your shoebox and help that garden grow.
Amazing. Where can people find this show?
Wherever you get them pods, Help This Garden Grow. Also, respairmedia.com.
You can also find it at the peopleforcommunityrecovery.org, their website, which is also where you can contribute and support PCR towards building the Hazel Johnson EJ Center.
And we have the donation page for that on the Respair page too.
Amazing.
Oh, and respairmedia.com.
Yeah.
There's places. Thank you guys so much and for making this show. It's incredible. Everyone should listen. Well, I probably can't say that. This show is amazing. And it was really fun to get to chat with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you
so much for being in conversation with us, and also being in this ecosystem, right? Like, we look to you and we look to y'all's space and the work that y'all have done and the contribution you've made into so many people's lives who want to do this type of work or just tell their story or have a platform, we see ourselves as kindred, and it really means a lot to be here, especially in this time.
Yeah, it's a joy to be in an ecosystem.
I love you guys.
Love you too.